Hi, I'm Allie with the Sacramento History Museum, and thank you for joining us for another Find Out More Fridays of our Neighborly series, where we take a walk in neighborhoods around Sacramento and give you a little bit of history. Now, for today's Find Out More Friday, I'm going to be talking about the neighborhood called the West End, and that might be one some of you aren't familiar with it. Where exactly was the West End? Well, as you might have guessed, it was the western portion of Sacramento. There's already West Sacramento, that's a different city, so we have the West End here. It was usually considered to be the section of town from the Sacramento River to the state capitol. You can see that on this blueprint here, so from our river to the capitol. And I want to just point out this red line surrounding a lot of it on this blueprint. That is the area that got slated for redevelopment, but we'll get to that story in a moment. So the West End is where I am standing right now. Today we might consider it to be downtown, and it has a lot of different micro neighborhoods. There's Old Sacramento, there is Downtown Commons, there's the K. But before then, it was considered the West End with its own micro neighborhoods that you might not see as much today. So we are going to start walking towards Old Sacramento. I just want to highlight a sign that we're going to pass. This sign right here does show, if Alex can get it in frame, the many different areas that are still here in the West End today. And you'll notice there's a Chinatown labeled on there. What you won't see is a Japantown. And that's something I want to talk about quite a bit because that was one of the most prominent micro neighborhoods here in the West End previously. All right, I'm going to attempt to walk backwards, which is not my strongest suit. Hopefully Alex will tell me if I'm going to trip over anyone.
I got your back.
All right, perfect. So, what did the West End look like originally? It was the gateway to Sacramento. It was the gateway to Goldfield. It's where community development, business development, all development here in Sacramento started. Most people coming to the Goldfields would get off a boat on the Sacramento River and head outwards from there, or they would settle right there on the river. So it was a very mixed-use neighborhood. You would find buildings and residences commingling with a lot of bustle of activity. The closest area to that today is Old Sacramento, the historic district. That's the closest to what this entire West End neighborhood, all the way from the Sacramento River to the Capitol, would have looked like. However, of course, over time, things change. Development comes in, buildings fall into disrepair, and a reputation soon came for the West End for being a slum. It was considered a blight on the community. In fact, some said it was one of the worst slums in the entire western United States. And 2nd Street, where part of Old Sacramento is today, was considered a skid row. This upset many city and business owners in Sacramento, and so they called about for change, especially because at that time we didn't have the major freeway intersections coming into Sacramento that we do today. So any businessmen or travelers coming from San Francisco to Sacramento were greeted at first sight by the Skid Row, or the slum part of Sacramento first, and it was considered an embarrassing entrance into the city. Now, in the 1940s and 50s, following World War II, nationwide there was a call for redevelopment. And federal funds were allocated for different cities to get rid of what were considered their socially and economically depressed neighborhoods, i.e. their slums. And so Sacramento decided they were going to participate in this nationwide trend of redevelopment, which is just taking something that's already developed and changing it into what they consider to be something better. And so in December of 1850, the Sacramento Redevelopment Agency was started. And they created a plan for this part of town to be redeveloped into similar to what we see today. And one of their biggest plans was the Capitol Mall project, creating a beautiful scenic entranceway to the city. But they weren't the only agency involved in redevelopment. The California Highway Division also got involved. And so they were at this time working on creating these freeways that we see here. They wanted to incorporate the East-West Freeway, which we know today as I-80, going all the way from San Francisco to Maine. And they also wanted to incorporate the West Side Freeway, the section of which we now know as Highway 5. And so that was part of the plans. There were also a few other agencies that saw this opportunity to create development in the city where previously there hadn't been any. But the way they were talking, it was as if no one lived here, as if it was just a desolate and abandoned area, and it wasn't. It was a bustling, vibrant community here, especially in the Japantown in Sacramento, which was a micro neighborhood that dated back to about 1880s. And by 1920s, Sacramento actually had the 4th largest population of Japanese Americans of any city in the entire United States. And so they generally lived in an area that was bounded by 3rd Street, which I am walking along right now, to 5th Street, and from L Street, which we're just about to hit, to O Street, a 6-block neighborhood. All right, I am going to probably mispronounce this, and I apologize this, but to them the neighborhood was called Ofu, which was consisting of 2 Japanese characters. It meant sakura, or cherry blossom, and capital, or city. It was considered a city within a city. It had 300 businesses and about 4,000 residents. And you could see cherry blossoms lining the streets of much of this area. Now, this today is the Downtown Plaza parking garage, or the Downtown Commons parking garage. But it used to be one of the prominent businesses here in Japantown. It was the pharmacy of Harold, and again, excuse my pronunciation, Owe? Oh no, where's my picture of him? Here we are. So this is Harold around the 1930s, standing outside of his establishment. At the time, Japanese Americans weren't allowed to work in white pharmacies, and so Harold started his own establishment right here on the corner of L and 3rd Street. And I also just want to highlight oh well, we'll find it. Here we go. Just how vibrant this community was, this Japantown here in Sacramento. So this was on 4th Street between L and what was Capitol Avenue at the time, what we know as Capitol Mall today. All right, now Ayui's Pharmacy was a very popular hangout for local Japanese youth, and he was considered to be a prominent figure in our community here. But despite how important a lot of these community members were, in May of 1942, because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, our Japanese American citizens here in Sacramento were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to internment camps, Harold being one of them. He did return after, as did many early citizens here in Sacramento, and he unfortunately lost this location for his business, but he was able to move his pharmacy just a block away. So catty corner on 4th and L Street in what was the Sunimoto Bank building, which was another prominent business that had its assets frozen during World War II. He was able to move into his new pharmacy. So that's just the building. On the corner there, you can see the word foundation written on it. And it also looks nothing like it did in the 1940s. So here is what that building would have looked like when he was able to return from the internment camp and set up his pharmacy once again. All right, so now that we are in L Street, we are starting to be in the heart of what was once our Japantown. But, thank you, Alex. Even after being forcibly removed from their homes and being able to return, the plight for these Japanese Americans was not over. Redevelopment was going to ask them to move once again. So on June 15th, 1954, the Sacramento City Council held a hearing on the proposed redevelopment and Capitol Mall project. And there was a gentleman, Harry Takata, a well-known attorney and very prominent local businessman. And he was one of the first to speak. And here is a picture of that City Council hearing about the proposed redevelopment project from the Sacramento Redevelopment Agency. That's Henry Takata right there. He was considered sort of the mayor of Japantown, In fact, he had been involved in the community for quite a while. This is him in an earlier picture. This was actually a signed declaration presented to the city after the Pearl Harbor attack, pledging their loyalty to the United States and saying that they did not condone the Japanese actions, but unfortunately it was not enough and they were still forcibly removed to those internment camps. During his speech with the Redevelopment Agency, he talked about how much his community loved being here in Sacramento, and he even highlighted that during their time in internment camps, many of them dreamed of returning back here. In fact, by his accounts, about 90% did return to their generational homes here in Sacramento, and they didn't want to leave yet again. And those pleas were successful at first. That year, in November 15th, there was a ballot initiative, and I've lost my place here. Yes, a $1.5 million bond ballot measure asking to pay for the cost of this Capitol Mall project, and it was unsuccessful. So the residents of Japantown and of the other West End neighborhoods around were able to be spared for some time. However, that's when the Sacramento Redevelopment Agency got creative. And I do want to highlight before we cross the street, this building right here one more time that used to be the Tsunamoto Bank building and later Oi's Pharmacy at the second location. All right, so I am not a politician or an economist, so I'm going to try to explain this the best that I can. The Sacramento Redevelopment Agency decided to use a new funding technique that had only been approved by the legislators 2 years prior and had yet to actually be tested. It was known as tax increment financing. So the entire Capitol Mall project was going to cost about $11 million. $5 million of that was expected to be recouped by selling the land they were about to raise, but they still needed to cover that other $6 million. Now, as I mentioned earlier, redevelopment was a nationwide trend at this time. And so they were able to secure $4 million in federal funding for this project, but they still needed another $2 million. And so the Sacramento Redevelopment Agency on July 1st, 1956, issued its very own tax increment bond for that other $2 million. And that allowed the city to start acquiring this property. On September of 1956, the city acquired the first of 15 blocks that were to be redeveloped. I'm going to go back to my map really quickly. No, I'm not. I've lost it. But these 15 blocks were centered around Capitol Park, and they included where we started our walk today, where the Macy's Shopping Center is, as well as the K District and Old Sacramento that we know today. There was a 2-story structure at 526 Capitol Avenue that I'm hoping we'll walk a little faster and we can get to. Thank you, Alex. And this was actually the first building that was destroyed. So the mayor himself decided, or sorry, not the mayor, the governor himself decided to sit on the crane and make the first demolition move. It was considered a celebration and a sign of the new change that was to come to this area. Unfortunately, not everyone saw it that way. Lots of people were interviewed by the newspaper and they were upset at having to leave their neighborhoods. They were offered a small sum, but for many, it wasn't enough. They tried to move to other neighborhoods, including in Oak Park, but it kind of set off a cycle of redevelopment here in Sacramento. So many of the white property owners in Oak Park were upset that Black and Japanese and Mexican and Korean and Portuguese citizens were moving into their neighborhoods. Banks started a redlining process, and before you know it, many considered Oak Park to be yet another slum. And so once again, there were calls for redevelopment, And these people had to move yet again. Some were pushed completely out of Sacramento, and as we walk around today, you'll notice that there aren't any homes around us anymore. So there definitely left a human void in what used to be the most populated, most integrated, most historic part of the town. There's hardly any actual residences anymore. In fact, the census numbers show how dramatic this change was. Let me pull up the exact numbers here. So in 1950, the U.S. Census found that this area, had 4,467 people living in it. That area that they assessed was the Capitol Mall and included almost all of Japantown as well. 20 years later, in 1970, they found that that number had dropped to 377. So a 92% drop in population. It went from a bustling neighborhood where there were churches, dances, festivals, Boy Scout troops, to one that's largely businesses and doesn't see many people calling it their actual home. It's a place they visit, but a place that we saw during the pandemic. If there's no events at the Golden One Center, if there's no reason to come to work here, it quickly becomes empty and hollow. All right, so now we are walking down 6th Street towards Capitol Avenue. And that is the location of the first building that was destroyed. And it's a very busy intersection with a lot of interesting history that I want us to talk about. So in addition to this being a Japantown, there were quite a few other residents that I mentioned. It was a very ethnically diverse neighborhood. And there were 2 prominent jazz bars at this same intersection across from one another. One was the Zanzibar Club, and one was the Momo. I tell you, I put these in order before we leave the museum, and I always seem to lose them. Here we go. The Momo Club. And these jazz clubs both had Black business owners and were considered to be important launching points and gathering places during the Civil Rights Movement, as they were integrated and they allowed people of a variety of different backgrounds to come together and talk about potential change. And so the Momo Club was catty corner where that federal building is today. Directly across from us was that Zanzibar Club. And then in 1959, I'm so used to talking about the 1800s, they were finally able to rebuild after destroying that 15-block radius. And this intersection was also where the first building was rebuilt. The Federal Building, right here at Capitol and 6th Street. Which I have somehow completely lost, and that is just fascinating. But nonetheless, that is the building you can still see there today, the Federal Building across from us, built in 1859. Ah, here it is, right there. So not much has changed. You can see it's almost identical, just with a little bit of a facelift there. And you can see that's where they have the widening of the streets that will pass as we walk down Capitol Avenue. The green boulevard that they created as an entrance to the city, as opposed to its previous look. As you can see here, this is the ceremony that they had to commemorate the first building starting to being torn down. And you can see that it is just a traditional street without that median divide. And you can see the Capitol in the background, which of course is still there today if you look all the way down Capitol Mall. Now, I mentioned earlier there were over 300 businesses and 4,000 homes in this neighborhood, and very few of them were able to survive. Harold Owie, who I mentioned before, was one of the only businesses, although he did have to relocate, who was able to stay afloat after this redevelopment. And this is the sign denoting the future location of his pharmacy. It used to be at 4th and L, that Sunimoto Bank building, and it was moved onto V Street. It was actually able to stay there until 2007. So quite a long lineage for that family, but very few other families were able to be as successful after this. As we're walking up to 5th Street, I also want to point out where Henry Takata's residence was, and a bit of the irony there. So his residence, separate from his law offices, which were at 4th and L, was at 5th and Capitol, right across from us here. This is what it used to look like. And the irony I want to point out, if you see this sign here, this was actually taken after the Takatas were forced to leave and when the Sacramento Redevelopment Agency moved in themselves. This was one of their first offices here in Sacramento. Most of the later buildings that would move in after the federal building were banks. Wells Fargo was one of the first ones. Macy's was also one of the first ones to move into that downtown plaza, what we know today as Downtown Commons. And for the most part, the area hasn't changed too much since then, but we continue to see redevelopment in other sections of West End. That downtown plaza was majorly changed recently to include the new Golden One Arena. The K used to be all pedestrian and recently reopened more to vehicular traffic. They are currently in talks with various different idea makers, planners, developers to design the waterfront in Sacramento to be different. And even Old Sacramento has been going through rebranding, being the Old Sacramento waterfront instead. And we can see that Macy's there on the corner right now. That did go in. Let's walk. As part of the redevelopment of the West End. And you can see how much older it looks compared to the more modern Polanco, for instance, or the Golden One Center. That's a more recent development. So redevelopment really hasn't stopped. In fact, some people joke that the moniker of Sacramento should be, instead of City of Trees or Farm to Fork Capital, it should be that we're the city of redevelopment. And we were considered to be one of the best at it. We paved the way for other nationwide redevelopment to happen. This was considered to be an excellent model for what redevelopment could be for other neighborhoods. We got high praise nationwide. In fact, on April 7th, 1964, nearly 10 years after this whole plan started, with that important city council meeting where Henry Takata spoke, Sacramento competed against 24 other cities around the nation and won the 1963 Ward Melville Gold Medal for their community development efforts. And many people consider it still to be one of the best things we have done for our urban core, but of course, others disagree with that. It demonstrated the devastation that redevelopment can have, ousting a strong, important community and setting off a chain of events that would create a lot of disenfranchised inequity in Sacramento for years to come. And something I like to point out is that despite the efforts to make this beautiful new entrance here on Capitol Mall and pushing out the Japantown that was once here, up ahead you are going to see a giant 1-block radius section of what used to be the heart of Japantown completely empty. It's been empty since 2005. For nearly 17 years, one of the main blocks you see on entering our city is a giant hole. Because after Japantown pushed out, the Sacramento Union was there. When the Union folded, the building was demolished with the expectation of some high towers to replace it, but they were never built. So despite the best efforts of redevelopment, our city still isn't quite the beautiful shining star entrance they hoped it would be here on the Capitol Mall project. So I'm going to leave you with that thought about redevelopment and the West End neighborhood that we used to have here in downtown. We will be taking a break from our neighborhood videos next month because we're going to be talking all about newspaper history. So the Sacramento Union will probably come up as we talk about that with Jared and our print shop. We hope to see you next month. Thank you so much. Bye.